Welcome to you all to this Coram Society discussion, which explores the issues and modern day ramifications, as it were, of Coram's past, present and future. I'm Carol Homden, I'm the Group Chief Executive. And today we are focusing on a lasting theme in policy and public discourse throughout the whole history of Coram from its origins in 1739 as the Foundling Hospital. And we're looking at how we think, speak and act about people living in poverty and the consequences and issues for children. It's a centuries-old concept of deservingness. Were those people living in poverty deserving of support despite need? And it is tied, of course, into the history of this organisation, with Thomas Coram's campaigning for 17 years to create this first children's charity, now simply named for him, in order to provide for children who were most definitely not considered deserving. Indeed, they were illegitimate and abandoned on the streets of London or relinquished, no doubt with grief and trauma, by mothers who were destitute and unable to care. So I can think of no better speakers and contributors today than those that we have with us. I would like to thank our speakers. First of all, introduce them to you. So Polly Toynbee is joining us. She is the Guardian political and social commentator, former BBC social affairs editor, and her books include Hard Work, Life in Low-Paid Britain, The Verdict on the Labour government, and The Lost Decade on the current government. Her latest book, An Uneasy Inheritance, My Family and Other Radicals, we no doubt commend to you to purchase now. But all I would say is thank you for joining us tonight, Polly, and indeed for all the service that you do to the discourse for people who need support in our country. To speak first is Professor Harriet Ward, CBE, an honorary research fellow at the Rees Centre at the University of Oxford. She's also Emeritus Professor of Child and Family Research at Loughborough University, focusing her research on the relationship between the state and the family, both now and in the past. And we are privileged indeed to have Harriet as a long-term friend to Coram, helping us so many ways through time, and most recently on the development of the timeline in coramstory.org.uk. So to introduce the structure of this event, may I urge that you do contribute in the chat and place any questions that you may have for the panel in that chat. But first of all, Harriet will begin with a presentation on the historical roots of this concept. We'll then have a discussion between the panel members with a Q&A to explore that legacy and contemporary dynamics of this dichotomy before we open the floor to questions from the audience. May I hope that we will have as many contributions as possible from the floor. Please bear with me if I kind of don't see you, just you will need to include in the chat, and we'll be able to come back as a panel discussion once the presentation is completed. And finally, my thanks to you all for joining us and to those generous individuals who have supported this area of work with donations. So I'd like to first of all introduce Harriet to make her presentation. Harriet, over to you.
Good evening. Just going to get this to, So good evening. And first of all, thank you very much indeed for inviting me to speak at this event. It's an issue that is of great concern and interest to me. I'd like to begin with an apology. Some of the language that was used in the past, and sadly in the present, but more frequently in the past, about people who were poor, children who were in the care of the state, people who were finding it difficult to cope, was extremely offensive. You'll have to bear with me. This is the sort of things that people said. And maybe one of the advances that we have had recently is that some of this language is now considered unacceptable. So I'm going to cover in the next few minutes a number of questions, or at least I'm going to raise a number of questions. So the first one is, who are the deserving and who are the deserving poor? And why would anybody want to distinguish between the two groups? And what about children, particularly children in the care of the state? Are they deserving? They're children after all, or are they undeserving? And how has that been conceptualized over time? And Coram's children, George II's innocent subjects, the title of this session today, were they deserving or were they undeserving? And finally, I'm not going to speak about this, but we hope that the discussion will cover how far is the discourse of today informed by the legacy of the past, and does it matter if it is? So who are the deserving and who are the undeserving poor? Well, poverty has been endemic in the UK for centuries, and it's related to structural issues such as fluctuations in the economy, changes in the labour market, inadequate wages, all sorts of issues over which individual people have very little control. Until the 16th century, poverty was extremely widespread. The vast majority of the population were living on subsistence, barely able to survive, and poverty was accepted as inevitable, ordained by God. And because it was ordained by God, people supported the poor with charitable donations. It was their pathway to heaven, for instance. But also the big religious houses supported the poor. The monasteries and so on were really important in providing support for the poor. And one of the problems was that after the dissolution of the monasteries, there was no system by which poor people might be supported. There was nobody who was central to providing them with help. And there was widespread hunger and homelessness. And there were concerns all along about whether we would reach a threshold at which poverty became so extensive that there would be a rebellion, that there would be civil disorder, riots, and so on, possibly a revolution. And the first major Poor Law Act was introduced in response to that, to those fears. And once you start a system whereby it becomes the responsibility of the community to support the poor and everybody has to contribute, then you have to decide perhaps who is going to be eligible for receiving funds and who is not. And I think it's because of that that we begin to get this concept first made explicit in the Poor Law Act of 1563, that there should be deserving poor and undeserving poor, people who are deserving of support and people who are not. And the deserving were the aged, people who are unable to work because they were disabled or unwell, children, and the deserving unemployed. That means people who were unable to find work, but they were trying to. And the undeserving poor in 1563 were regarded as criminals, robbers, and beggars. We see right from the start this attempt to try to dissociate some people who are poor from others and to vilify those who were thought to be cheats, not trying to work, not trying to support themselves. The first major poor law is the Elizabethan Poor Law, 1603, and that consolidated a lot of legislation that had gone before. And it was key in that it introduced a national system of poor relief based on parishes. It's important to know it was based on parishes because that's where you get the issues about settlement. And it specified that the impotent, or rather the deserving poor, should be offered support at home or in almshouses, hospitals, and poorhouses. And the undeserving poor, the vagrants should be sent to houses of correction. There's an issue about vagrancy all along. And the able-bodied poor should be sent to work in houses of industry. And it also introduced apprenticeships for parish children. These, I think, too, are very significant. Because Blackstone argued quite a while later but he thought that this was an extremely valuable move, because he says that our laws have in one instance made a wise provision for breeding up the rising generation, since the poor and laborious part of the community, when past the age of nurture, are taken out of the hands of their parents by the statutes for apprenticing poor children, and are placed out by the public in such a manner as may render their abilities in their several situations of the greatest advantage to the Commonwealth. In other words, it was legitimate to remove children whose parents might not be bringing them up in such a way as they might become independent in adulthood. It was permissible to remove them and place them out as apprenticeships. The rich, on the other hand, were left at their own option, whether they will bring up their children to be ornaments or disgraces to the family. And there you get the dichotomy between the rich and the poor. The 1834 Poor Law Amendment Act is the one that most people are familiar with. It was introduced partly in response to the Speenham system, whereby inadequate wages were supplemented by poor relief. And that, I hope, is going to be one of the issues for discussion. When wages aren't enough, it's possible to introduce poor relief to support them, thereby letting off employers the responsibility to provide adequate wages. And this legislation introduced the principle of less eligibility, that paupers should not be seen to be advantaged over independent working people. So you couldn't provide poor people with anything that anybody who was trying to support their own families without parish support was able to provide. And outdoor relief, which we'd now call benefits, was reduced as much as possible. And in theory, only people who were regarded as deserving, that would basically be widows, the elderly, the sick, and children. In theory, only they were able to receive outdoor relief. And indoor relief was provided in the workhouse for those who were thought to be scroungers, the undeserving poor. And it was intended as a deterrent. You couldn't really provide them with less to eat because they would have starved. So instead, they made the regime as dreary and monotonous as possible. They separated husbands from wives, parents from children, and pauperism was deliberately stigmatized. The element of shame was very strongly reinforced. So who are these undeserving poor? They were regarded as a threat to the good order of society. And over the 17th, 18th centuries, there's a lot of talk of idle beggars, sturdy rogues, and vagabonds. And legislation was introduced, which was really quite horrifying, designed really to suppress itinerants, beggars, and people who were thought of work shy. At some stage, beggars could be branded, they could be imprisoned, and indeed, anybody who was convicted twice of begging could be executed. In the 19th century, some of that legislation had been repealed, but there was still huge concerns about the surplus population, the unemployed, who again prone to rioting. People were very concerned about huge numbers of unemployed throughout the 19th century. And there were schemes to try to remove them from the country, to emigrate them, for instance, or to segregate them and incarcerate them in order to prevent them from breeding, because it was thought that they would have so many children that the rest of the population would be overwhelmed. And it seems incredible now, but many, many philanthropists subscribed to these schemes. For instance, William Booth, who set up the Salvation Army, wrote a book called In Darkest England and the Way Out, which was basically a plan for how to remove the surplus population, the unemployed, and incarcerate them somewhere where they wouldn't be able to affect the rest of the population. And those juvenile emigration schemes that many people will have heard about, they were aimed partly at rescuing children from destitution. And we do have to be aware that destitution was a very real problem. Many children didn't have enough to eat, didn't have anywhere to live. But they were also aimed at separating children from their parents and other undesirable influences, so that they might not just be saved from want, but also from perdition. There were concerns that parents were not bringing children up into a Christian way of life and that they would be damned if they weren't rescued and sent as far away as possible. And this is John Middlemore, who set up the Middlemore Immigration Homes in Birmingham. The principle on which we act is that Birmingham is the worst place for a child of a Birmingham criminal. Let there be a complete breach from his early associations. Let them be taken right away, be seasick, see icebergs, learn to talk through their noses of dollars and cents, and have their world turned entirely upside down. The new world is, in the fullest sense, a new world to them. But it wasn't just idle rogues and beggars who were considered to be a threat to the good order of society. It was also prostitutes and unmarried mothers. And this is because they were thought to threaten the sanctity of matrimony. They had sinned against the marriage vows, and often there was very little distinction made between unmarried mothers and prostitutes. And some of the legislation intended to deal with women who had had a child outside marriage was again very draconian. In 1609, for instance, they could be sent to the House of Correction for a year, and if they had another illegitimate child, they would remain there until they'd found sureties for good behavior, which basically meant they would remain there for the rest of their lives. Under the Poor Law Amendment Act, the penal sanctions were removed, but unmarried mothers had responsibilities to support their children, and single women had very few opportunities to earn enough money to support a child. Most women's occupation, apart from anything else, was residential. You couldn't take a child with you into domestic servants, or indeed as a shop assistant, most of whom lived above the shop. In 1913, the Mental Deficiency Act was introduced, and that made it possible to incarcerate women as moral imbeciles. That was if you were in receipt of poor relief at the time that you gave birth to an illegitimate child. And when I was a student social worker in the 1970s, I met a woman in an old people's home who had been there since her 20s. She had been incarcerated under this legislation. And one of the issues, of course, was that illegitimate children had no rights. Until the late 19th century, an illegitimate child was nobody's child. They had no they had no blood relations. They weren't considered as having relations, no one to protect them, no one to enforce any rights. So what about children in care? Were they deserving or undeserving? Well, some of the legislation says that all the children, all children are part of the deserving poor, that category fits children. But pauper children didn't matter. There were very high mortality rates in the 18th century. Jonas Hanway found that in one of the London parishes, 86% of abandoned pauper infants died in their first year. Although many of them were taken in by parish nurses, these nurses didn't look after them. In the 19th century, children whose parents were on indoor relief, the children in care would be children whose parents were on indoor relief. And they were grossly stigmatized. They were made to wear pauper uniforms. They were separated from their parents. They were placed in poor law schools. And most of all, they were taught to be ashamed of their parents' poverty. And indeed to be ashamed of their families and themselves. And you can see how little value these children have when you look at some of the legislation. If you're an employer and you had a pauper apprentice, if you endangered their life, caused them a disability through abuse, the penalty was only 3 years imprisonment. When you think what draconian sentences there were for other crimes, that is really shocking, I think. And indeed, the only recourse really for poor families who couldn't support their children was to be separated from them. Until 1963, the state could only support these children by removing them. And in the 20th century, we see that some of these children had very restricted opportunities. Some of the more draconian measures of the poor law have been removed, but there were still theories that these children should be less eligible. They shouldn't be offered the same as other children. They were, for instance, not always allowed to take up scholarships because they weren't for the likes of them, that sort of thing. And I think this concept of less eligibility was only overcome by the Children Act 1989. And one of the reasons these children, pauper children, had so very little rights and such great discrimination was that a high proportion of them were illegitimate, without rights and without parents. So what about the Coram children? Did they differ from pauper children in care? After all, they were dependent on other people. They were dependent on charity, not the poor law, but they were dependent. Their mothers had offended against the sanctity of holy matrimony. However, the mothers weren't regarded as undeserving, and I think that's because right from the start, the aim of the society was to rehabilitate the mothers, not to punish them for having an illegitimate child, but to give them an opportunity to start afresh, to start their life again. We may have a lot to say about the value of this policy, but at least it wasn't to do with trying to punish the women. And indeed, these women were not all the same as the sort of women who were dependent on the poor law, because entry was restricted to very young children whose mothers were previously of blameless character. So if this was your second illegitimate child, they wouldn't be admitted to the foundling hospital. And indeed, most of the voluntary societies in the 19th century argued that they took in a better class of children than pauper children, and I suspect that the Foundling Society had similar views. However, they may not have been regarded as pauper children, but illegitimacy remained a major issue. And indeed, in the 19th century, some of the other voluntary societies refused to admit illegitimate children, such as Dr. Muller's homes in Bristol, or they tried to make sure that mothers realised that it was a great privilege to have their children admitted by charging them more than they charged other parents. The Children's Society did that. And the Foundling Hospital didn't do that, but they made sure that they knew that the children were aware of the shame of their birth. In the 18th century, the foundling children had to sing this hymn on Founders' Day. Wash off my foul offence and cleanse me from my sin, for I confess my crime and see how great my guilt has been. In guilt each part was formed of all this sinful frame. In guilt I was conceived and born, the heir of sin and shame. What it did to the children having to sing that, heaven knows. And this persisted into the 20th century. This is John, who recorded his history for Coram. I can never remember anyone saying to me, "You were born out of wedlock," but it was made very, very clear that our mothers had done something wrong and that we were also to blame. We were guilty and we felt guilty. And the interesting thing is that guilt follows you through life. It doesn't disappear. But maybe we should end on a positive note. Because the founding hospital children were not regarded as paupers, there wasn't any fear of dependency. So they weren't sent out to work at the first possible moment, as poor law children were. They were sent out to work at an older age and they were given much more supervision. So there was much better provision for care leavers than there would have been for poor law children. And because they didn't have to prove that the foundlings didn't have they didn't have to make sure that the foundlings had a worse quality of life than the children of an independent labourer. There was no less eligibility principle. It meant that the foundling children were offered better quality of foster care than poor law children were, much better health care than children within the community, and much better education. And there was no suggestion that their opportunities should be restricted. Nobody said this isn't for the likes of you. So in the 18th and 19th century, some of the foundlings were apprenticed to wealthy benefactors. Someone was apprenticed to a goldsmith, for instance. Others were apprenticed to merchants. That offered them huge opportunities for employment in the future. Some of the girls were given scholarships to Camden High School from the 1920s. And unlike many other children, music was part of all their lives. So there we are. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Harriet, and a really fascinating overview and journey through legislative framing and social wars. So I'm just going to ask Polly if she has any immediate response to make to that presentation. What chimed with you, Polly, to make a few reflective remarks before we go into discussion?
I think it's very important that we should know that history, because it does help us to understand where so many attitudes come from now. And although the big change is about illegitimacy, and that is, you know, if you look back to 1963 and not really full rights until 1989 for illegitimate children, I mean, that's very recent indeed. And it has been a huge social change in attitude since then. You know, illegitimacy barely exists as a category now, that very large numbers of children live with unmarried parents, might be two or might be one parent. So that's a change very much for the better. But nevertheless, the underlying principles of deciding who's deserving and who's not absolutely runs like you know, through a stick of rock all the way through society, through all governments, through all attitudes towards tax, social security, what the state should do, not do, ideas of welfare, as opposed to, which is sort of Americanization we've taken up, as opposed to social security. It is a constant battle that decent politicians have to fight to persuade people that their taxes are well used on the deserving, and that the conditionality of handing out benefits is very strict, and that the borderline is constantly policed between people who might be cheating or frauds or swinging the lead in one way or another. I mean, I've got a wonderful book here. It's called In Search of the Scrounger, and sociologists will know Alan Deacon, and it has a good introduction by Brian Abel Smith, a famous sociologist, going through exactly all of this, these attitudes towards scroungers, skivers, cheats, the idle poor, and saying how, you know, there are virtually none of those. It's virtually impossible to get benefits if you don't genuinely need them, and that the life on benefits is miserably poor. Although it's always better under Labour governments than under Tory governments, it's always been pretty low relatively in this country compared to equivalent countries, except of course America. So it's deep in us. And when we think about what we want to do about policies towards those people who do need state support for all kinds of different reasons, I think we have to not just dismiss all of that as irrelevant. I think it'll always be relevant and always important. And the question is, what language do we use? And how do we persuade people that the border is well policed without being brutal to some people, or without being exceptionally mean in the benefits that we hand out? So that history is valuable because it is still with us.
Thank you, Polly. And this is what we're going to explore now, is how it is still with us, where it has come from. As we turn to that, I just wanted to ask Harriet to reflect a little on Thomas Coram himself, because every time I hear these and I look at the enormous amount of time it has taken to effect legislative changes, here was this sort of curmudgeonly bloke who was absolutely a practicing Anglican. By the standards of the day, was extraordinarily progressive or radical. You know, do we have any understanding of where that came from? And also, as it were, the consequences, the sort of causes and consequences. Do you have any sense, Harriet, of that from that journey, as it were, into the creation of the founding hospital in this extraordinarily alien landscape, really?
Well, I think he was an outsider, wasn't he, all along? And I think that that was probably extremely valuable for him. He he had to fight really hard to get the foundling hospital off the ground. And I think because he expected to fight, he was probably better at it. I don't know why it was that he had such compassion for children that other people thought ought not to be supported at all. And he had to fight battles about whether he was encouraging illegitimacy, encouraging immorality by setting up the foundling hospital. I don't know where that came from, whether that was, but I suspect that he found a cause and he was a fighter and he was determined to win. I think the other interesting thing about him was that he didn't have children himself. And I think that that was incredibly important to him, to have children in his life who he was able to feel that he had been able to support in some way. I think that's very...
I mean, we speculate, and we don't have with us today Gillian Wagner, who wrote Thomas Coram Gent, but it is a phenomenon that Thomas Coram and several of the people who came together did not have surviving children of their own. That doesn't, of course, mean that they didn't have any children, really. We're quite unclear on that. But actually, the Thomas Coram and William Hogarth and Handel, all of whom were involved at the time, none of them had any children, any surviving children. So there is something very important here about that, that motivation, that perhaps grandparentness sense, and also from Thomas Coram's time that he spent in America, the idea that you shouldn't be wasting lives. You shouldn't be wasting lives, but rather in pursuit of the common wealth, the common good. That kind of sense that somehow, you know, society needs all that it has, seems to come across. And you are right, certainly, that he was a fighter and he took up several causes, including inheritance rights for women, which of course was a key feature in this. So this issue of illegitimacy, which has traveled through time for so long, you pointed out that it was really very late in our legislative frame and also in our discourse that illegitimacy and poverty from the point of view of children are entirely intersected. How do you think that those changes, how far have those changes actually gone in terms of that intersection? The discussion about illegitimacy may have changed, but how? When do you point to that? What have been the drivers of that change? If we ask Harriet and then Polly to have a think about that.
Well, I would say that one of the drivers that has reduced or really eradicated the stigmatization of illegitimacy is the growth in people cohabiting without marriage. It's become such a common occurrence that you can't really sustain you can't really sustain stigmatization when such a high proportion of the children are born outside marriage. I think that has had a major impact.
Mm-hmm. Polly?
Well, in some ways, what hasn't changed is that to be a single parent is to be the very poorest. All of the figures show that the very worst off are people struggling to bring up children on their own. So that although there isn't officially a stigma in the sense that the disappearance of the church from most people's lives or from the idea of marriage as a sacrament has gone, and so illegitimacy isn't, there is still, society seems to be quite happy to allow it to be the case that bringing up a child brought up by one parent is going to really suffer and is going to do considerably worse, throughout their childhood than a child living with two parents, or at least a child with a father that perhaps contributes. An awful lot of them don't. So that it's still there. as a very important social fact that illegitimacy, if you like, or call it a single parenthood, is hardship.
Yes, and this is before we start looking at some policy interventions, such as the 2-child limit, for example. I am mystified how we can possibly have a society that considers that whether a child needs to eat or be supported is determined by which number they might be in the family, for example. So thinking about that,
Can I just say something else as well? That when we said we've forgotten stigma, we've got to remember what a short time it is since Peter Lilly sang a song about single mothers who get pregnant on purpose just to get a flat for life. Just towards, mid-90s, towards the end of the 90s, as soon as that, it was all right to publicly stigmatize women who got pregnant without a man to support them, so that it was their fault that they were poor, and it was bad that the state was handing them flats. The idea that it was that easy to get a flat was, of course, ridiculous. But so it's still very, very recent.
Yes, and I was thinking about the importance of Cathy Come Home, for example, of that, landmark film, which was in the 1960s, and certainly within our memory, the way in which that discourse has changed, or how little it changed, perhaps, as you're saying, over those 30 years. So why does it still exist? Why are we still behaving in this way? Do you have a thought on that, Polly?
Well, I think it goes back to deserving and undeserving. The idea that people expect the state, the taxpayer, you or me, to pay for them bringing children into the world. And there's, you can hear it on what people say sometimes in the audience in question time. I've been very careful to have only those children my husband and I can afford. Here are people wantonly having children, expecting me to contribute to their upkeep. So it's not exactly the stigma, the moral stigma of illegitimacy, but it's again this idea that people are taking us for a ride. They're using taxpayers' money and expecting to not necessarily live the life of Riley, but to live an acceptable life. That's what people imagine life on benefits is, though of course it's not. And again, that's the big dividing line between deserving, undeserving.
Harriet?
I think too, you could go. Sorry, am I muted? No. I think too that you could go back to Coram and his view that it's a waste. You need to have a society in which children are supported regardless of their circumstances, because it's such a waste not to support them. We need to be sure that whoever is looking after them, whatever their parents are, children should never be discriminated against. And I think we do have major issues at the moment. We have huge issues about children's health and so on. The rickets has been diagnosed, and there's widespread malnutrition. We have lost some of the underpinning of our society that makes it possible for people whose circumstances are not very favourable, including unmarried mothers, to support their children. And I think that's something that we really do have to consider and to change.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, we're indicating here some of the reasons why this matters. I mean, how do you see signs of change? So if you take that, let's just take the last 25 years. So since the Peter Lilly incident that you're describing then, Polly, but into now, and the kinds of causes and consequences of a decade of austerity. Do you see signs of change, and what are the catalysts?
Yes, I think possibly. I think what we do see, unfortunately, though, is that old people are much more protected than children, so that, you know, politicians will trot out the old saying, you know, children are our future, and yet not willing to invest as much in them as they are in older people who have triple locked pensions. And, you know, pensions may not be enormously generous, but an awful lot more generous than a lot of families who are now living on deficit with their outgoings well beyond what their incomings are, and appalling bills to pay that they can't manage. But I think if you're looking for signs of hope, I was at a meeting last week where Professor John Curtis of NatSen, who do these major studies every year of British social attitudes, definitely finding a very large change in favour of adequate benefits, which is very reassuring, and finding it right across the board. Even people who still call themselves conservative voters, of whom there are many fewer, but anti-welfarism he saw very much on the wane. And when people are asked, you know, do you think we should cut benefits, say no. They certainly overwhelmingly think benefits should always rise with inflation. Quite a lot think that we should tax more and spend more right across public sector, which includes social security. When they are asked the question, which they tend to get asked every year, many claimants don't really deserve any help. The number saying that's not true is overwhelming, whereas there have been times towards the end of Labour being in power when benefits did get more generous, when a lot of people did say, yes, they thought that was true. The question now is whether we're on a pendulum swing, that when you have a very austere Tory government, people get more sympathetic towards those who've been really hit hard. I think people are very shocked to find food banks in quite affluent places, the numbers of people who need them, knowing that these are people who are in work. And I think the question is whether that's just a pendulum swing, and whether if we get a Labour government that, as most Labour governments usually do, is much more generous in benefits, they begin to swing back, or whether we are into a state, which I think is possible, of genuine change in social attitudes, that the young are not turning to those attitudes as they get older, much less turning towards the conservative mindset. So quite possibly we are into a more democratic state of being, if you want to be optimistic.
Well, I do very much want to be optimistic, of the school of philosophy, which is, let's be optimistic that the glass is not only half full, but someone might come along in a minute and fill it up. But actually, one of the things that concerns us is that the social demographic of our society is now so heavily weighted up the age spectrum. And in fact, the number of children has actually reduced, and that, you know, the children are actually in the smallest minority of the population, probably in history. So they didn't always survive because of all of those issues of disease and hunger and fragility. But actually now we have a population that does vote, that is much older. And as you rightly say, there has been an effective policy for helping to tackle the poverty of pensioners with the triple lock. And this is why Coram's Charter for Children calls for a triple key, which is a financial mechanism which basically rewrites the social contract to the young. Children uniquely depending, of course, on school infrastructure and on early education access through childcare provision, and also through sort of socialization opportunities, as well as in the poorest families, depending upon the benefit infrastructure. So I guess I'm interested in your thoughts there about how that rebalancing can be affected. You know, is it policy that changes attitude, or attitude that changes policy? Obviously, that's a yin and a yang, so public sentiment is very positive. But I'm thinking about through history where there have been shifts of mechanism, if you like, whether that's legal or financial. Harriet, where do you see those turning points, and should we be hopeful of a turning point now?
Well, I think one of the obvious turning points was the introduction of the welfare state after the Second World War, where we had huge upheaval. And I think the condition of the poor, which is not the right way to say it, but the lives of very poor families were much more evident, partly because of evacuation, of course. And so that is a hopeful turning point in which things improved dramatically, I think, after the introduction of the welfare state. I would love to think that we have reached a turning point such as that again. I'm not certain that we have, though I think there are some green shoots, there are some pointers, and Polly's expressed a lot much more eloquently than I can. But there are, Labour has a child health policy, which I think needs to be much better publicised, and that is trying to look at the issue systematically and universally rather than individualistically. And I think that's maybe where you get these turning points. There was another turning point, though, where things moved backwards after the introduction of the 1834 Poor Law Amendment Act. Before then, I think there was a view, which I think was, well, there are issues about this, but there was a view that the labourer should be able to buy bread, and when the price of bread went up, then the poor rate went up, the amount of relief went up. The problem with that was, though, that wages remained low, and it was the poor rate that was depended upon. There wasn't an incentive to increase wages, which I think there should have been.
So we have seen, obviously, commitments to the national minimum wage and the living wage within this period. Are they enough, Polly?
No, I don't think they are enough. And, one of the problems for poor families is that the minimum wage goes up. They lose a huge amount of universal credit. Every pound extra that they earn, they get somewhere between 60, 65p knocked off. Well, if anybody said, let's make a top take rate of tax at 65p, there would be outrage. So, we're not nearly there yet. But I think we need to remember how influential politicians are and how they talk. That back in, 2010 to 2015, we had Ian Duncan Smith hammering away at about how undeserving the poor were, saying things like, and he said in an interview, we're going to end the something for nothing culture. And I'm going to say to these scroungers, this is not an easy life anymore, chum. I think you're a shirker. I mean, that sort of thing. You had George Osborne talking about the good family, and next door was the bad family with the blinds pulled down, and when the good family were going out to work early, there was the lazy family still asleep in bed. No thought they might be night workers or anything like that. I mean, just the deliberate stigmatization that was very effective, and it was taken up by the media. You had Benefit Street on television and a whole series of programs done by something unbelievably called Love Productions, absolutely looking for any kind of mental cases or scallywags or criminals that they could find, and presenting them as if they were typical of people on benefits. Yeah. Which was utterly disgraceful, but very effective. And I think if you have a government that begins to talk the other way, begins to talk about the value of every child and the importance of every child, I think it's always easier to talk about poverty in terms of child poverty and children, in the way that Dickens sort of knew that children were the way to get at people's better feelings. I think you can help change attitudes from the top.
Thank you. And we're getting some questions in the chat, and I want to come to the question of the role of men in a moment. But Andrew Ireland, Andrew, such a distinguished former director of Adult and Children's Services in Kent, and Andrew, has asked about whether we have sunk to a point where people are shocked, and we're being shocked into action by the decline of public provision and the prevalence of drugs and violence, for example, or whether some of the media coverage of things like knife crime and so on is reinforcing those notions of undeservingness that Harriet articulated. Do you have are we shocked, or are we actually immune to this shock?
This is for me.
Yeah.
Well, I think, knife crime is a difficult one because, people do weep over the death of these young boys, mostly boys, and are shocked. We had 2 killed yesterday in Bristol, and people feel they are vulnerable, not just that they're venal, and maybe not until they're dead. And obviously the question of knife crime and, gangs and kids having knives because they think they're protecting themselves against other kids with knives is a genuine, terrible social problem. But since, we closed nearly all the youth centres, sacked nearly 4,000 youth workers, connection service for teens with any kind of problems was dismantled. People also say, what would you do about juvenile crime? They all say, and this is, people with quite right-wing views too, do something to help them, do something to support them, set up youth centres. And there's a lot of willingness behind that. And, Yvette Cooper was saying last week, I was with her and Keir Starmer in Milton Keynes, and they were talking about knife crime and their plans to have straight away 100 youth hubs to start off with that would bring together all the existing services and bring in a great deal more support for young people. And, I think there's nobody who opposes that idea. So I'm hoping that that's what gets going.
Mm-hmm. Harriet, does history shine a light on that question of shock? Because you indicated that there was the fear of civil unrest. And of course, we have seen cycles in our own lifetime of unrest, the Toxteth riots, for example, and so on. Do you feel that we're at some of those points of shock?
I don't think that the sort of civil unrest that I think you can see throughout history is greater than we're experiencing today. After all, throughout the 19th century, they were worried about the French Revolution and it spreading into England. So I don't think we have that sort of fear, but I do think we have shock. I think we are shocked to find the growth in food banks, for instance. I think many people are horrified by that. And one of the shocks that did produce huge change was the discovery in 1946, I think, that children were still living in the workhouse, that Lady Allen of Harwood went and visited a workhouse and found children there. She wrote a letter to the Times that had a massive impact, and that led to the 1948 Children Act, which was much more beneficial to children and families and so on. So sometimes you can hit the right moment and something really shocking catches the news and catches the public imagination. And maybe we will reach that point.
I mean, we do have, I used to serve on it just for full declaration, but the Youth Justice Board and the change since the sort of ASBO language, which has actually seen a very significant reduction in the number of children who have sort of entered the criminal justice system in that way. And it really is, a small proportion of children who are known to the youth justice system in that way, but rather a much larger group of children who are affected by fear, by a sense of lack of safety in their homes and their community, which feels like a different type of discussion is needed, as Polly was saying about the importance of youth services. And perhaps only now we realised what we had when it was gone. We've had a question from Carolyn Hamilton, and Carolyn is the director of Coram International, who is asking about child benefit and the importance of the kind of reinstatement of that kind of notion of universal child benefit, so something that's specifically about the child. Harriet, you mentioned some points in history where there were changes in, of course, what was then, I think, called poor relief. But is that kind of mechanism the one that helps to shift the language and to reinforce, as it were, the removal of that notion of deserving versus undeserving?
Yes, I think it is, because I think apart from anything else, child benefit was universal. It was available to everybody, not for the first child. It was thought that everyone would be able to support one child, but for the second and subsequent children, it was available regardless of your financial circumstances. And I think that policies that are made available on a universal basis, they reduce the stigma, they reduce the gap between those people who are excluded and those people who are not. And I think that they are very valuable indeed. My grandchildren have free school meals, not because they live in families which require them, but because they live in London. And I gather all primary school children in London have free school meals. That's a benefit to all children, but it also reduces the gap between those who are disadvantaged and those who are not.
Ollie?
I think I strongly agree about free school meals. Children can come to school hungry for all sorts of reasons, of dysfunctional families who are not necessarily poor. And I think that's excellent. I think where we are now with the appalling state of benefits as they are now, this government is saying, quite likely in the next budget, one of the two next budgets we're going to see before the election, that they want to give back child benefit, not universally, but to push it further up the scale. At the moment, I think around about 50,000 is the cutoff point, and they want to put it up to 60 or 65. Well, at this point, if I had some money to spend on needy children, I don't think I'd be giving it to families between 60 and 65,000. So at the moment, universalism feels like a luxury that you can't afford. And I would want it to go to those children who really have almost nothing.
Yes, we have a debate point there, yes.
Can I just say that I absolutely get Polly's point, but I would take it back. I would give it to everybody, but I would take it back in tax from those people who are earning over a certain level. It's the principle that I think is valuable.
Certainly, we decided to include within the Coram Charter the importance of free school meals, that it is the universalizing way of supporting a community of children to feel part of a community of children and to all be able to access that together. It's also very realistic and deliverable. You know, certainly specifically primary schools, it's a bit more complicated in secondary as I understand it, but you know, they are an infrastructure that can serve the children that need them. And therefore, you know, it is a way of making sure that it is the children. If you want to think about some of the language games and fears that some parts of the political spectrum have, well, it's definitely going to the children. You know, that is undoubtedly the case. I wanted to ask a little bit more, because we've had a number of questions about this as we were talking about, why is it always the mothers? Okay, why is it always the mothers who are to blame for the illegitimacy? Doesn't it take two to tango? You know, thinking we ran a very interesting discussion about the long march to women and children's rights, that children really have no rights at all unless mothers have rights. And it was only, I believe, in 1860, wasn't it, Harriet, that mothers had any kind of a jurisdiction actually over their children in the tender years, for example, in terms of custody. So what do we feel about that dynamic in relation to illegitimacy and poverty and the position of women? And has that actually substantially changed? big question. Harriet, has it changed?
Yes, I think it has changed. It's a huge question. I entirely agree with you. I think you can trace the development of children's rights in tango with the development of women's rights throughout the 19th century. And as women get more and more rights, so do children. And you can trace it through different acts of parliament and through different cases that were fought in the Court of Chancery too. So I think that is pretty clear. And I think that women have gained more power in my lifetime, much more power in my lifetime. And that may be one of the reasons why legitimacy is no longer so stigmatized. It's not so easy to denigrate the woman as it was in the past. But yes, it's unfair. And yes, it's always been a man's world, and that's one of the major issues that we're still confronting.
Yes, we still don't yet have a majority or even equality of women in Parliament. Perhaps we need to wait for that before we're going to get the full rebalancing. Polly, what do you think?
Well, attempts have been made to try and get men to pay for their children. The Child Support Agency has always struggled. It was an uphill struggle. It was brought in towards the end of the last Conservative government at the sort of mid-90s. A good idea, right thing to do. There had always been some system by which Social Security officers were supposed to try and chase up fathers, and this was a more systematic way of doing it. Huge outcry. There were demonstrations of men, men dressing up as superheroes. Every time I write about it, I am inundated with rage from men saying, this just isn't true. We're being asked to pay too much, or yes, we do pay. But the outstanding debt to women from men within the CSA is absolutely enormous. I mean, massive amount of money owing to children, basically. And the men regard it as paying for ex-partners, and they don't believe it goes to the children, or they refuse to say it's for their children, or they, endless stories about, well, she's got lots of money anyway. It's been really, really hard to drive this policy through. And is only slightly successful, but not very. And if you could make it work, I mean, they've got the powers. You can impound a man's driving license or his passport, but they don't seem to do this very often in chasing up the non-payers. But, it's the right thing to do.
It just always strikes me that the conversation is always about the grown-ups, whereas the conversation needs to be about the children. It's the child's right to be supported.
But the men always put it back onto saying, well, actually, the money, I know it goes into her pocket and she'll use it for this, that, or the other. The men don't deny that they should pay for their children, but they say that's not where it'll go. And I've seen what car she drives or whatever.
Yes, exactly. So back to some of these mechanisms where we have to ensure that it is perceived as well as actually able to demonstrate that it's the child that's benefiting. So hence the thinking about the importance of some of these universal mechanisms. But we have a question from Johnny Hoyle, and Johnny, who's a social work manager, I believe, in North Yorkshire, a very progressive council of the moment, but also a trustee of Coram Voice, who talks about the fact that we're still within leaving care services. So thinking back to some of what we started talking about, how the Foundling Hospital was supporting and how the apprenticeships in their early origins were, that we've still got a significant proportion of young people leaving care where the pathway plan has been for their main source of income to be benefits. And how do we move a society and system so that, like for most other parents, it's for their children to leave care with good housing and an ability to earn income and have a career pathway? Have you seen changes through time in that, Harriet, that can throw light on that subject?
I had to say I'm shocked by that question, because I had thought that leaving care services had improved, and clearly I'm mistaken if pathway plans are to live on benefits. I think there has been some movement. I think care leavers have a much higher profile than they did 20 years ago. And they themselves have a much louder voice in the community. And there have been attempts to try to improve services for them, clearly not as successful as I had thought that they were. One of the advances that I think has been made has, again, as a result of a universal initiative, there have been an increase in care leavers going through tertiary education, going through university and further education. And it's not huge, but we now have something like 11% of care leavers get degrees, which is much more than the 1% than it was 20 or 30 years ago. And I think that has been because there has been an incentive for all young people, or as many as possible, to go through university. And again, there's this issue is if you introduce a universal policy, some of the most vulnerable will benefit as a result.
Mm-hmm.
So I
Holly,
think that,
have you seen changes in that regard in relation to, I mean, there's care leavers, there's also, as it were, the whole sort of school leaving age and the ways in which young people progress towards employment and careers.
Have been some improvements in their rights and the obligations of council. But there are also disgraceful stories of the numbers of, teenagers still dumped in a flat miles away with a cheap landlord somewhere, no social worker because they're in some borough far away, under some council who doesn't even know they're there because the child doesn't belong to that authority. Interested, I was in Cardiff this week hearing that they now have a pilot scheme, which is a basic income for care leavers up until they're 25, with the hope that if you know you've got this income, it's not conditional. Everything else you earn above it is additional. It may set them on a path in life, and it is only a pilot scheme, but that may produce very good results, and it maybe show us a lot about what basic income might do. But I'd love to hear what Johnny Hoyle himself thinks.
Indeed, I don't know if we can bring Johnny to the form, but as Johnny is coming in, just to say that within the Coram Charter, we have pointed out structural age inequality in even what are supposed to be our benefit arrangements. So if you are under 25 and living alone, you get less benefits, even if you're a care leaver. Well, that's just a straightforward age discrimination and needs to be challenged. Johnny, please give us your reflections.
Yeah, hi. Sorry for the really long question. I guess I was struck recently when I saw the statistic that as a care leaver in England, you're twice as likely to be a prisoner as you are to be an apprentice. And it's that notion of how do we swap our goal to be really aspirational? How do we expect people to leave care into good jobs, into good careers? And if you do that, will you then see outcomes improve for young people? Because Harriet rightly said, there's been a push for care leavers to go to university, but 11% is nowhere near the statistics for the rest of the population. So it was kind of more that how do we get society to start really valuing care leavers as having different skills and abilities, but loads of potential.
So that's a good rhetorical question there, Johnny, for us to ask. And I do think that one of the things that's important from history is this importance of the supported apprenticeship. Mm-hmm. So going to university is actually really difficult, in the sense of navigating that transition and having somewhere reliable to live, and when you can't go home in the holidays, having somebody who's helping you out, as it were, in terms of a college or university, your essay skills and so on. And so those are really important support structures even within that. But the apprenticeship model of the Foundling Hospital actually just guaranteed that you were going to have an apprenticeship of some kind.
Only to agree. I think, you know, the notion that we stop caring at 21 or 25 is not the idea. You know, when you've, as you said, Carol, if you've moved out of foster care or residential care, you've got a flat and you've spent your setting up home allowance on a bed and a wardrobe and a sofa, all of a sudden the idea of going to university can be really difficult, and we need to do much better in terms of supported apprenticeships. It strikes me that the idea of Thomas Coram was making a personal connection between those people who owned industry and those people who needed those apprenticeships, and maybe that's something that we need to think more about.
That's a really good point, Johnny. So we will be needing to come to a close in 5 or so minutes, but I'm interested to know whether anyone else would wish to make a comment from the floor, and hopefully our facilitating team can identify if you would, but please come into the chat if you do. But one of the things, so Johnny, I think, has popped off, but I wanted to point out that there should be no rationing of compassion. That actually, it's for each of us. Do we have a limited well of compassion? Is there something that stops the local authority from using its discretion, Johnny? So what is defined as a minimum is a minimum. Is there something that says you can't do more than the minimum? Johnny, it's a rhetorical question back to you.
It's a really good question, and a nice segue really into one of the things that we've done here. We've created what we call Always Here, and that basically says if you're a North Yorkshire care leaver, you can always ring us and we'll always help if we can. But it's something that we'd like to see from most local authorities. If you're 26 or 27 and things go wrong, we all need somebody to turn to.
It feels to me that we all need somebody to turn to is a very good and important point to kind us, to an extent, bring us back where we started. And that feeling of the poverty of means of support being wider than the equation of financial infrastructure, however vital that is. So I'm going to bring us now to some closing remarks. So given that he's joined us on the panel, I shall ask Johnny if he has a closing remark before I go to Harriet to draw closing remarks from, as it were, historically into today, and Polly perhaps today into the future. Johnny.
I just wanted to say a huge thank you. I've really enjoyed tonight. Thanks,
Johnny. Harriet?
Well, I've enjoyed it too. I think it is terribly important to understand the past, because if you don't, you just repeat the mistakes of the past. You need to be able to understand where some of the discourse is coming from and how sometimes it's been refuted in the past. So the discourse, for instance, about illegitimate children, that has, I think, been overcome over time, but we need to be aware of it so that we can identify other issues that also need to be overcome.
And do you feel, Harriet, what can we do at this juncture to change the way poverty is discussed?
Well, I think we need to change the discourse, don't we? We need to challenge the discourse about scroungers and strivers and all that sort of stuff. I think that loose language is very damaging. And that is something that can be tackled, I think.
Polly,
I
will be tackling
agree.
it?
Yeah, I strongly agree with that how we talk is very important. But when you say no rationing of compassion, that is impossibilism. There is a rationing of compassion. There is so much that we are willing to give, and only so much, and only on certain conditions that we know that it's going to the right place and the right people and the right children who need it most. I still think, I'm afraid, there is no way of abandoning some policing of the borders to compassion, generosity, benefits, and all of that. And if you start out thinking there isn't, then maybe you won't achieve the goals that you need to achieve. And you have to be realistic about all of us having a part of our brain that says, I don't want to be cheated. I don't want anybody to hand my money to a beggar who turns out not to be a beggar. And, you know, everybody also has a genuine well of compassion to call upon. And, you know, the leaders need to find a good way of calling on that compassion within people.
Yep, I absolutely agree with you. It's not that I was trying to imply that we don't have a limit, more that the attitude of mind that we bring to bear on it and the way in which we talk about people. And of course, what one might describe as the small acts of kindness that each one of us can do. In that sense, there was something important, albeit that it never landed, in the notion of the big society, that notion of the sort of social embracing of all in our community was what I was perhaps trying to get at. And so if there was one thing that you could now do or change, Harriet, what would it be?
Oh my goodness. I think if the one thing that I would try to change would be the need for food banks. I think I would raise the issue about how humiliating food banks are, how humiliating it is to live in a society where people are dependent on charity in order to be able to eat. And I think that issue needs to be publicized, and we need to try to ensure that not only benefits, but also wages are sufficient to ensure that nobody has to depend on something like that.
And Polly?
I love the Coram Charter's triple key. I think that's a stroke of genius, and I think people get it. If you have a triple lock, you've got to have a triple key for children's future. And I really like that. And also, I would bring back Sure Start, because I find wherever I go, if you say Sure Start to people right across the political spectrum, people light up and say, yes, that's the right idea. Help families from the very, very beginning, from when babies are born. And bringing back Sure Start, I think, would help a new generation.
Thank you both very much. And what I would say is that within the Coram triple key is the proposal that you help all children. So you help all children by making sure that the investment in our schools and childcare services that they depend upon uniquely do go up with inflation, that there is age equality, so an equal chance, a fair share of resources, an equal chance irrespective of age, including, for example, the pupil premium being equal no matter your age, and a secure future so that no child falls out of the benefit network, that there is no child without recourse to public funds. So if we had our way, then within that, it would be all children, within that, the poorest children, within that, the poorest, youngest children. So on those few remarks, I would thank our speakers, Harriet Ward and Polly Toynbee tonight, and the added Johnny Hoyle and all of you who have asked questions. Thank you for your interest in Coram and for joining us. And please do, if you haven't already, signed up to the Coram Society mailing list to hear about future events. We have a regular programme of these discussions to play our small part in trying to tip the dial of discourse You can find more about Corum's history on corumsociety.org.uk and our Voices Through Time programme funded by the National Lotteridge Heritage Fund. Please do, of course, visit the Foundling Museum to explore some of these themes still further. There is no cost to joining, but we thank you particularly for those who have donated. And finally, if you are interested in the Coram Charter and you feel you could lend your support, you can find details of that on the Coram website, which is coram.org.uk. With that, we say a very good night. Thank you very much, and let us all look to the future with hope. Thank you.